this race got to the point where he wasn't even thinking about chasing down the Mercedes. His message to his engineers was, do what you can to beat Checo.
After his incredible performance in Saudi Arabia, he has not capitalized on that momentum to push the championship to Max.
Has Fernando ever been this way with other teammates? This kind of camaraderie?
Welcome back to another episode of Fine Margins. I am Ben. I'm obviously joined by my co-host Bella. So we are here after the Spanish Grand Prix at Catalunya, and this was a weekend which included the classic Max and Red Bull dominance, some big names going out in Q1 and Q2 of Quali, and a nice little Mercedes resurgence. In this episode of Fine Margins, we will cover the entire weekend, including the race results and key takeaways, and each team's performance and what that all means for the championship.
Before we start, here's a little intro into our channel. We give you everything you need to know to follow F1, but our USP is that we also dive into its bigger picture, like the future of F1 for women, diversity, sustainability, business and more. If you love the sport and everything that goes on behind it, you've come to the right place. So if we look at the key takeaways of today's race, essentially to summarize it in a few points, it was Max dominance and adventures with the track limits. Mercedes' upgrades seem to be performing quite well based on the pace that we saw both in Quali and the race. Ferrari are back to averageness, I would say, and unreliabilities with their car, or rather inconsistencies in performance. Alonso had a disappointing home race, which is a shame considering the success he's seen over the beginning of this season, and McLaren were very much one-lap wonders today. But if we dive into the depth of each team, let's kick off with the continued dominance of Red Bull, who started first and 11th, or who qualified first and 11th, and finished first and fourth in the race.
Well, firstly, it's clearly, again, another race, the very, very dominant car that they have. It was another incredible Max masterclass. I think for the last two races, he has led every lap and just didn't look like he was going to get challenged. He did, had some issues with track limits. He got the black and white flag for exceeding track limits 3 times. And if he did it again, he would have had another 5-second penalty, which doesn't really make any sense because he was leading the race by 18 seconds, I think, and he got the fastest lap. His engineers had to keep telling him, Max,
bring the race home.
Yeah, we're winning this by 18 seconds. There's really you could, get your foot off the pedal a little bit. So, usual classic Max race, these last couple of seasons, complete dominance. Checo has struggled, and he struggled the last 2 races. So he qualified P11, and that was due to spinning and ending up in the gravel in his second flying lap of Q2, because he said he hit a wet patch on one of the curbs and lost control and spinned out. So he started P11, had a nice little drive to go back and move and finally finish 4th, but didn't have the speed to chase down the Mercedes, which is odd because Russell started 12th and Checo started 11th. And Russell had a really nice start to get ahead of him. But, like I said, Checo in that Red Bull car did not have the pace to hunt down George Russell. And it kind of really shows that he's been struggling these last couple of races, which is such a shame after his incredible performance in Saudi Arabia. He has not capitalized on that momentum to kind of push the championship to Max. And Helmut Marko has come out and said that already in this season that Sergio Perez's championship push is over. So, yeah, he's going to have an incredible rest of the season to kind of make up the gap he's already left to Max.
Absolutely. Especially considering Max is leading each race by like 15 to 20 seconds on average. So when there isn't kind of any major mishap, the pace that he has in that car is nearly kind of unmatchable. But now coming forward to people who have kind of only just become competitive as a slow, gradual rise to this season is Mercedes, who qualified 5th and 12th, and their quali probably should have been better, and we'll talk about why that didn't happen, and finished 2nd and 3rd, which really was the best finish they could have had considering their start. So surprisingly, quali pace was quite good for the Mercedes. Hamilton looked very strong. In terms of his quali lap, the reason it didn't come higher is simply because, as he acknowledged on his final lap that he was going for, there was a snap in the steering wheel and that lost him 2/10. So it was user error, and that's what put him behind likes of Sainz. So overall, we're starting to see not just race pace from the Mercedes, but also quali pace. In terms of George Russell, he kind of struggled more with the car in terms of the rest of the weekend, but it was the collision with Hamilton that I think had an impact on his qualifying lap. Essentially what happened there is Russell was on an out lap and avoiding quite a lot, or not avoiding, moving out of the way for quite a lot of cars. And then when his race engineers told him he could go for his actual lap, he was going to overtake Leclerc. And then rather than looking behind him, obviously he was looking in his right wing mirror to see where Leclerc was as he was kind of turning. And then actually Hamilton was also going for his flying lap and went into the side of him, causing some front wing damage, which affected his time, but also he didn't have a great time in the car. In terms of the races themselves, just a very good race. George made a very good comeback, picking his way through the field, really having some late braking. He outbraked a lot. There's the infamous on that first corner outbraking Sainz. Solid performance of the tyres on the track and very good pit stop strategy, rather a pit stop strategy that didn't go wrong out of perhaps some slower pit stops for Lewis Hamilton. Their car performed really well at this track, and that's the case as well for when they've been at Barcelona before. And then I think the funniest moment with Mercedes when George was like, there's rain at turn 5. And then a little bit later, he's like, is anyone else predicting rain, or is it just the sweat from my helmet? And it turns out it was the sweat from his helmet, which was quite funny.
It was also when I think he made the move on Ocon, and he was like, what do you think of that? And it was like, solid move.
Yeah.
Like, just solid? He's had some funny moments, George. He's a funny guy when he's not hitting people into turn 1.
Yeah, and Toto, I think, came on and it was like, yeah, it was all right, which was quite funny. But then moving on to their competitors, who they surpassed in the constructors, is Aston Martin.
Yeah, so not as good as a weekend for Aston Martin as it has been previously this season, but I think they'll be satisfied with 2 cars ending up in the points. So firstly, they started 6th and 9th in Quali, and then they finished 6th and 7th. So it was not a great weekend for Fernando Alonso, which is a shame to see in his home race in Spain, especially after his excellent performance at Monaco. In Quali, he ended up in the gravel, which caused some damage to the underside of his car. And as we know, the underside of this car is where the majority of downforce is generated in these new generation of Formula 1 cars. So he went off in the gravel, damaged the underside of it, and that obviously cost him speed for the rest of Quali. I think it happened in Q1, if I remember correctly. So he was struggling in Q2 and Q3. A better weekend for Lance Stroll, considering he's had some rough qualies last couple of weeks, starting 6th and also finishing 6th. This is the first time this year that he's qualified and finished ahead of Fernando Alonso. So hopefully that will bring some confidence. But the commentator said during the race, it seems like the first race for Fernando Alonso that most races he's looking forward, he's chasing people down, but this is a race he was looking backwards, and they seem to have not had the race pace this weekend. I don't know if they chose the wrong setup for their car. Maybe this car's not suited to a track like Barcelona, but it was just, a disappointing weekend, like I said, compared to the highs they've hit this season in previous races. But it was also nice to see that the bromance has continued between Fernando and Lance Stroll, where Fernando was behind Lance Stroll and he was closing the gap, and he went on the radio and said, tell Lance not to worry, I'm not trying to overtake him, I'm just trying to extend the gap to the cars behind him. So he's trying to get in the DRS range of Lance. But yeah, like I said, slight disappointing weekend, I'd say, for Aston Martin, but 2 cars in the points is 2 cars in the points.
Has Fernando ever been this way with other teammates? This kind of camaraderie
He definitely wasn't like this in Ocon. We know that in Alpine. His last McLaren days, when McLaren were dreadful, I honestly can't remember even who were his teammates, man. Who were his teammates? He wasn't like this with Lewis Hamilton, that's for sure. I don't think his relationship was bad with Felipe Massa at Ferrari. And I was too young for Fernando Alonso at Renault, so I don't know much about when he was winning championships. How was he with the team? But
Yeah.
I can only remember
Yeah.
the bad times with teammates
It's just
like Lewis
interesting.
Hamilton and Ocon.
Yeah. Yeah. Because his persona would not. I don't know whether it's to do with they get on, or he doesn't see him as a threat, or there's an understanding with Lawrence Stroll, or whatever it might be. But it's very interesting, this kind of mentor, guardian-ish type. I mean, to give credit to Lance, not that Lance needs all that help, but I've not seen this. I also don't hear about this much camaraderie from other teams, unless it's like a planned strategy.
No.
Whereas
Alonso's
just doing it.
Sorry to jump in your point. Valtteri Bottas is also, he's a really good teammate to Zhou. But Bottas has always been a great teammate.
I agree. No, exactly that. The only example I had in this race was Bottas slowing down the grid for Zhou. It's interesting because now Mercedes are surpassing Aston Martin, but I'm curious still to see that battle between them, Ferrari, and Aston Martin in the next following races. I do think that's where the bulk of the interest is in this season. Yep. Speaking of the Devils, moving to Ferrari, who qualified second with Sainz and 19th with Leclerc. So this is the first time he's been out in Q1 since 2019, if I remember correctly. So really poor qualifying for him. And they finished 6th and 11th, which again, Sainz wasn't able to hold his position. And yes, like Leclerc made a good comeback, but that was kind of expected. He just didn't manage to get into the points. Seems to very much have been something wrong with Charles' car. That's kind of the narrative that he took in all the press, both after Quali, to the point that parts of the car were sent back to Maranello for analysis. Apparently, in all the left turns, the balance was wrong in the rear axis of the car. But, as Ferrari are, they did have good Quali pace, or at least for Sainz. It's just a shame because Sainz's race got to the point where he wasn't even thinking about chasing down the Mercedes. His message to his engineers was, in that kind of last quartile of the race, do what you can to beat Checo, which they also were not able to do. To which Martin Brundle replied, hire Adrian Newey, which is, I think, the trend of most teams this season and in the last season. The scary thing is that this is a weekend where Ferrari has brought upgrades, which have not really upgraded their race pace or quali pace. Carlos said, why would you bring upgrades to this race? Which is interesting because the Circuit de Catalunya used to be the testing track for the teams. Yeah, what do you think went so wrong in Charles's quali and race?
Something is wrong with Leclerc's car. Because, you can say that Leclerc had a bad quali, whatever, but he is not a P19 out in Q1. He's not a driver who would do that, and that Ferrari is not a car that would do that. As rough as that car is at the moment, it is not a out in Q1 type of car. There is something wrong with that car. Apparently, it's been sent back to Maranello, the factory of Ferrari, to kind of investigate, see what was wrong with it. Yeah, so it's hard to say. Hopefully they'll give us answers of what happened, because it was clear that there was an issue with that car. But it's disappointing from Sainz's perspective, and I think this has been a key issue this year in Formula 1, that when they got P2, they said, we're fighting for P2, we're not fighting for a win, which I think is really disappointing. And I think a lot of drivers this year, and I think to the tail end of last year as well, no one wants to fight Max, and no one wants to fight that Red Bull, to defend position. Because whenever it happens, whenever Max is steamrolling behind you, and sometimes Checo when he's having a good weekend, it's, they're not our race. We're not racing the Red Bull, so just let them pass. And it's, if the car in P2 is doing that, saying, the Red Bull's not our race, we're not racing the Red Bulls, then obviously it's going to be the case for the rest of the grid. That's why I was a bit disappointed that Lewis Hamilton wasn't able to start P2, because I think obviously the Mercedes are more likely to race.
He always goes for the win,
and Hamilton, then Hamilton and Russell, they're not the type of drivers who, if they start P2, they'll want to race for P2. They're the type of drivers that want to race for the win, and I think that's been a key thing throughout this year. It's just the races where Max started, obviously 15 in like Saudi Arabia, and he started like 10th in Miami, around those positions, and he was just carving up the grid because no one wants to defend. No one will defend because, like, this is not a race, and it's a bit I mean, obviously, I completely understand why teams do it because they want to optimize their race. But from a fan's perspective, it is a little disappointing. And from the color signs, like we said, from the upgrades perspective, saying this is not a good track to bring upgrades, that's so odd. Like Barcelona is a testing track. It was chosen as a testing track for a reason. It kind of gives you it gives you a good balance of all the tracks. Has a straight, has some slow corners, has some medium to high speed corners. And to say that's not a good track to bring upgrades, that's strange. Monaco's not a good track to bring upgrades, like the Mercedes did. Obviously, they didn't plan to. They wanted to do it at Imola, but they had to bring it at Monaco because of the flooding in Imola, and obviously that's very sad to see. That's not a good track to bring upgrades. That's a very difficult track to kind of bring a new car, not a new car, but a car you're not sure of how it performs on track, and then figure out what's the best setup for. And they did pretty well, I'd say, in Monaco, considering that. Ferrari, they bring a new upgrade to Barcelona, which is a much easier track, and Leclerc starting P19. And then he started actually from the pit lane because they changed his gearbox, because obviously he was starting P19, so the penalty is P19 to start from the pit lane, so you don't really lose much. Yeah, I don't know. It's just, it's the same thing. We come on here each time there's a race, and there's always something to say about Ferrari, and how we question their methods, I think, is the nice way of putting it. But yeah.
Again, let's see what Fred Vasseur does by the end of the season. But there's not been any big changes that on a day-to-day basis seem to be moving forward. In terms of the Alpines, who Gasly actually qualified fourth, but due to a penalty for blocking two cars in Quali, received kind of 6th place grid penalty, started 10th, and Ocon 6th, finished 8th and 10th. So this Quali pace for the Alpines was actually very good, relatively. They're very much alone kind of in this position for fourth. I'm seeing how the McLarens are performing, and they got 2 cars in the points, which is great for them. But Gasly did struggle early on in the beginning of the race and did well to kind of make it back. So Alpine, they're a real mixed bag, but I would say the overall trend with them is upwards-ish, kind of. They're not making any major backtracks, but also not making any major steps forward. They're kind of just doing, what they do.
I think the trend's upwards, especially after the Alpine CEO, was it Laurent Rossi? I think that's his name. Laurent
was quite
Rossi.
harsh about them.
But he said, listen, we're not where we expect it to be with the funding that we put into this team at the stage of the season. And then they go to Monaco and they get a podium, which is obviously a lovely step up because a podium's a podium, and that's something they wanted to be challenging for this year, get a couple podiums. I do think they were quite fortunate at Monaco. Ocon put on a fantastic lap to get P3.
Yeah.
But Monaco race day it's very difficult to overtake, and Sainz, who was behind him, I think was clearly a faster car. So if that was any other track, Sainz would have overtaken Ocon, but obviously because it's Monaco, it's very difficult to overtake. So he managed to hold on to that P3 while arguably not having the third fastest car. But Gasly's put in some storming qualifyings this year, I'd say, as well. They've both been very impressive. Gasly has less to show for it because I think he's had a bit more bad luck. Like in Australia, he was around like P4, P5, and then half the grid had an accident at one lap, and it was like half the grid just disappeared, and obviously the Alpines collided with each other because there was nowhere to go, and it was quite an unfortunate event. And the same thing with Gasly now. He qualified P4, and then stupidly blocked off Verstappen and Sainz at Quali and got hit with a 2-3. He got hit with 2-3 grid penalty places. And starts P10, And then at the start of the race, he gets knocked back to 15, which makes his race even more difficult. So he could have, I think if he maintained P10, he definitely would have finished ahead of a car like Zhou in that Alfa Romeo. So that is disappointing to see. But, 2 points in the car is 2 points in the car. And they've solidified that 4th place they're nowhere near the speed of the Aston Martins, the Mercedes, the Red Bulls, and the Ferraris on most weekends.
Yeah.
So sorry,
So
they
then moving
solidify
on
that
to
that fifth position.
Yeah, 100%. Moving on to the rest of the grid. So the Alfa Romeos qualified 13th and 16th, finished 9th and 19th. Quite a good performance from Joe. Alfa Romeo's been out of the points for a while, so good teamwork from Joe and Bottas. Bottas kind of sacrificed himself by, in his words, slow down the rest of the grid, which the commentators were kind of like, not sure the FIA wants to hear that, but Bottas, in his very classic way, was like, okay, cool, like, I'll just slow everyone down, no worries, which he did. He held up the field, and Joe managed to kind of convert that into points, despite a nil run-in with Tsunoda, which is good, considering that behind him you had the likes of Leclerc in 11th trying to chase down whoever was in front of him to get into the points. In terms of McLaren, they qualified 3rd and 10th and finished 13th and 17th, and I would say McLaren it's a shame that there was a kind of a one lap wonder type situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they somehow got the tyres in the perfect window, at least for Lando Norris. I mean, obviously Piastri had a good quali session getting to P10, but Lando had a fantastic quali session starting P3. He drives the wheels off that McLaren, man. It's a shame he's stuck in that team, and I don't know why he signed such a long contract with them. But they said they knew. They were saying that we're not gonna get P3. The car is not fast enough. They did not have good race pace this weekend, unfortunately, and it didn't help at all that lap 1, Lando Norris gets overtaken by Hamilton and then hits the back of him and breaks his front wing. Has to then pit. And then he's at the back of the grid because he pits on lap 1 and does a front wing change, which takes like 20 seconds standstill, give or take. And from then on, he did not have the speed to chase down the rest of the grid. And I think if he'd be able to maintain that P3, P4 position at the end of lap 1, there was a good chance he would have ended up in the points, at the low end of the points, but still in the points. But yeah, that car is not fast at the moment. I think they need more sponsorships, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a lack of money that's the problem. In terms of AlphaTauri, they were 14th and 15th, and then they finished in 12th and 14th?
Yep.
Is that where? Yeah. Nick de Vries struggled in quali, having a few spins, but actually out-qualied Tsunoda despite that. And then Yuki was in the points, but lost that due to the time penalty he got for kind of pushing Joe off the track. It's clear to me like Yuki is he's a quick driver, but he just doesn't deal well under pressure, and he doesn't have that maturity. And the thing about F1 is it's not just about being the fastest man on the track. It's about being the fastest person on the track whilst not fucking up all the rules. So, stay within your track limits. Don't cause danger to other drivers. Don't rush through the pit lanes. Like, you have to have a level of composure that, if you look at Gasly, really silly thing. He qualied super well. Great, you were a very fast driver, but you weren't paying attention, or your team wasn't paying attention to the rest of the grid. And that's really where it is a team sport. But in this instance, Yuki just he doesn't let people help him in a way. And F1 is a team sport, but you need to let your race engineers and your team help you. And if he's not listening to them, or, driving reactively rather than proactively, it causes problems like this.
No, I agree. I think he needs to be a bit more cool-headed because, being a Formula 1 driver isn't only about being fast. You have to be a team player. You're part of a massive team. You have to be able to give good feedback to your engineers. You have to be likable. People want to work with you. And obviously, the more talented you are, the less those other things matter, but they still matter to a certain degree. I would say that he's probably at the best team for being a bit of a hothead, because Red Bull have always kind of liked hothead drivers. Just look at Max Verstappen. He can flare up on the radio even now when he's 1-2 world champion. He can still flare up at the radio at times. So I think maybe Red Bull even like that a little bit. But yeah, he really does. He's still a very young man, but he does seem to need to get a bit more emotional maturity when he's in that car in races. But also, I will say that
Absolutely.
he's driving the hell off that AlphaTauri. Well, like he's put in some stormy performances this year, and they've only got 2 points to show for it because I think that car is not great, and they've have some mistakes have also crept in. So it is a shame to see, but I think he has made a massive step forward this year.
Absolutely. Finally, coming to the last two teams, Haas qualified 8th and 17th. Really strong luck from Hulkenberg, but finished 15th and 18th. So again, like, good to be in the points, or good to be in the top 10 for Quali, but shame they couldn't kind of convert that, which is no surprise. And then, of course, we come to Williams, who qualified 18th and 20th and finished 16th and 20th. Just, like, not a quick car, which is a shame for Logan Sargent and Albon. Moving on to the drivers and constructors updates, Max now leads the drivers' championship with a 53-point lead, followed by Checo. Then comes Alonso, who leads by 12 points to Hamilton, George, Carlos Leclerc, Lance, Esteban, and Gasly. I am interested to see the kind of battle between Lewis and Alonso, but, you know, depending on how the rest of Alonso's season goes, I'm interested to see the battle between those three. And perhaps, George, in terms of the constructors, Ben, do you want to take that away?
Yep. So looking at the constructors, unsurprisingly, it is the Red Bulls still at number one. They've got a massive point gap to the Mercedes, who have now moved to second place. Aston Martin have dropped to third, like we kind of predicted a couple episodes ago, that Mercedes would eventually overtake Aston Martin. Fourth is Ferrari, and then there's a big gap to Alpine, who's fifth, McLaren sixth, Haas seventh, who are tied with points with Alfa Romeo, who are eighth. Then it's AlphaTauri, and finally it is Williams, who once again are at the bottom of the table.
And then to round things off in terms of F1 news so far this week, not a lot going on. The main two pieces you need to know about is Red Bull is shedding quite a lot of top talent and are obviously hiring as well to replace that talent. Essentially, quite a lot of key positions are leaving to other teams, and this is where the cost cap and its repercussions become quite interesting. Different players are offering these individuals, you know, double what they're getting at Red Bull, and as much as people might have team loyalty, they also do need to like follow their own paths, and because of the cost cap, Red Bull can't just match that. Ben, I know that you did a short on it and some research. You want to give a better picture to what's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. So Helmut Marko came out and said that top engineers, so people like Rob Marshall, who's left to join Aston Martin, and Dan Fallows, who is moving to McLaren, they're leaving for double the salaries or triple the salaries, and Red Bull can't match. And it's not that they can't match, they don't have the money, because as we know, Red Bull is a multi-billion-dollar company, and the Red Bull racing team has all the finances in the world because they're so successful. It's obviously, we believe it's obviously due to the budget cap that these top engineers, these teams like McLaren, Aston Martin, obviously aren't as fast as Red Bull. You know, they can shave off some engineers and hire these guys as they could be top guys in McLaren for much more money that they'd get at Red Bull. And I think another reason is also because, at least in the aerodynamics department for Red Bull, Adrian Newey is the top guy, and because
There's no progression.
he's so incredibly talented. Exactly. There is no progression. You know, you're gonna have to be one hell of an dynamicist engineer. Thank you, to be better than Adrian Newey, and obviously they don't just grow on trees like that. So there's not the progression at Red Bull. So you can then go on and be a top guy at another team.
Yeah, really interesting commentary I heard today was, you know, that Adrian Newey is as valuable financially, right, in terms of paying as, you know, most of those drivers on the grid. I would say in terms of assets, he really is a top asset for any team in the sport. And you were saying about how in Monaco, when they were forklifting the cars up, you got to see the flaws of the different cars, and the complexity of the Red Bull car is just in a league of its own, really.
The floor of their car is
Yeah.
incredibly more complex than when we got to see the Mercedes, and I think it just shows that, cause like we've said previously in this episode, that the majority of downforce from these new generation of Formula One cars is generated by the floor. The floor is much more important than something like the side pods, and everyone likes to make a big deal about the side pods because obviously they're quite visual, and Mercedes did the no pods, and Ferrari did the big bathtub ones, and Red Bull did another one. But the floor is actually the most important thing when it comes to downforce. So
absolutely,
it was incredibly complex, the Red Bull one, and I think that I mean, it doesn't. We are not engineers, and maybe a simpler floor is actually better, but considering the performance of the Red Bull car and the complexity of their floor, I think it's not crazy to say that they are perhaps correlated.
Absolutely. So that is it for the Barcelona Grand Prix. Thank you for listening to this episode of Fine Margins. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review. So those are the stars that you can see on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Because not only does it know us to know what you think, which is important, but it also allows other F1 fans to find us as well and get that information too. Do have a look at the thematic pieces, whether on F1 and sustainability or F1 and diversity. You might learn a thing or two, or find a speaker that you enjoyed, or check out the Let Her Drive series with some pretty incredible women in the motorsport space about how they got into it, their story, for anybody that's interested in that. If nothing else, thank you very much for listening, and see you at the next race.
Thank you, guys.